spring of 1968, and I was lost. It's the drug is crystal methadone. It's an injectable form of methadone that I was injecting, and I was living in basically a crash pad. And one night, just as I had taken a really large dose, and was lying back on my bed, barely able to move. And I used to think that was fun. Go figure, you know.
Yeah, go figure.
I heard a knock on the door, and a very, very dear friend came in. And we had lived together for a while out there, and then when he saw me spiraling down, he left. He said, I can't handle this. This is not where I want to go with my life. And so here he comes in, and I had forgotten that he had scheduled the time to come out and visit. And he found me the way I was, and he did what we now call an intervention. He got really, really angry. And I want to make sure that when I speak about what happened, that you understand that I don't want you to try this at home.
Yeah.
But he gave me, it actually kind of forced a large dose of LSD down my throat. And I was really helpless to do anything about it. And he basically said, this is either going to kill you or cure you. And right now I don't much care which. And he turned around and stormed out. And there I was.
Yeah.
Basically I was, and pretty soon I had forgotten that he'd even been there. And I was lost in this thing, and all of a sudden the LSD kicked in. And within what seemed like a few moments, I found myself kind of floating along the ceiling like a balloon. It was the oddest sensation. And I kind of had the thought to turn over and look down. It was just kind of rotating the balloon, and I saw my body. And Carl had been talking about how I was killing myself. And I could see my body stretched out on the bed, gone. I mean, you would even think I was alive. And I was 135 pounds, and, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, Maryanne, but I was, you know, dirty, and my teeth were rotting, and really typical heavy drug use. Oh, Carl's right. Carl's the name of my friend. I am killing myself. I'm really close. And I had been suicidal since at least 16, so this was a couple of years that I had many suicidal thoughts. And so I found myself at that choice point, that really deep choice point where you're able to say, do I want to live or do I want to die? Clearly, I made the choice to live.
Yeah.
And I came down the next morning from that trip, and I never did speed again, never shot anything again. I called my folks, and they came and got me that day.
What type of people were your folks? Because, you know, I hear that story and I think, oh my God, where are your parents, right? I mean, that's one of the first things that occurs to us. How did you get to be a junkie? You must have grown up in the Bowery. Is there a Bowery? Did I make that up? Was it from the 40s, right? There's no Bowery, but I'm saying, were your folks pretty normal people, just with some basic issues, hardworking folks like everybody else?
Absolutely.
Right.
They had a lot of love in them. My father, at the age of 19, was on the front lines in Germany during World War II. So he clearly came home with what we now call PTSD,
right.
post-traumatic stress disorder.
There you go.
And when they had me, my mom was barely 20 and he was barely 24, and they had no parenting skills other than they're very harsh parents themselves.
Right.
So their way of disciplining included humiliation and public shaming and hitting and slapping and go get the belt, go get the yardstick.
Right.
So from an early age, I had a lot of trauma around being what we would call now abused. We would call child protective services for some of the ways that was considered normal to discipline kids and keep them in line. I'm the oldest of 5 boys.
Right.
So you can imagine my mom having 5 boys in 8 years, and the efforts that they made to kind of keep us in line.
Sure.
And so by the time I was, 10, I was an absolute expert on distracting myself from a lot of the drama.
Right.
And the only way I could feel safe was at least psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, not to be present at all.
That's right. So hence the drugs, right? That's sort of the next logical step.
Oh.
Medicate.
And I was, my dad smoked cigarettes and smoked a pipe during that time. He quit pretty early on, but I started stealing cigarettes, and by the time I was my 13th birthday, I realized I was addicted to tobacco.
Yeah.
And so that's where I went. I just went off, well, if this is good, then more must be better.
Right.
And that's kind of what I did, was I was medicating myself.
Right. So you got on the medication train and drove it into the, 3 years later into the nearest wall. Had an awakening, I guess you would call it, because what? You started to hear God talk to you, or you heard God talk to you at that time.
I had that very powerful experience that night with seeing myself as dying and making a choice to live.
Right.
So I came back home. I reconnected with my friend Carl, who was living in the area. We had gone to high school together and so on, and was starting to have a good time again and feeling much better about myself. My parents immediately got me into some support, some counseling, and I started getting my teeth fixed and eating regularly, and all that stuff. But 3 weeks later, that friend was killed in a motorcycle accident. And that tore the lid off. Here I was just starting to feel like, and please let me explain the context. Martin Luther King was killed in April of that year. My friend died on May 1st. Robert Kennedy was killed the night of the California primary, the next one. So within a period of 2 months, really, I lost 2 heroes. And of course my friend is a hero as well, but I had a close friend.
Saved your life, ostensibly.
Totally saved my life. And then he was gone.
Right.
And I barely had a chance to even begin to imagine how I might thank him.
Right.
That, even more than getting off of speed, catapulted me into starting to look at the concept of spirituality. I had been a kind of a rabid atheist. But this emotional...
A rabid atheist. Not just an atheist, a rabid one.
And, and the grief that I started to experience was overwhelming. And I had no emotional literacy, no emotional tools with how to deal with any of this.
Oh, but you did.
Well...
You did. They were just tools that you don't build a relationship with the divine with. They're just different type of tools, right? Because the ego has distorted ways of loving itself. This is what a conversation that you get into later in your book, right?
So let me rephrase that and say healthy tools.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have
I'm a bit of a fuss budget when it comes to that sort of thing.
I have great tools. I had great tools in terms of how effective they were at distracting me from feeling my feelings.
That's right, which is the ego's function.
So,
to avoid pain, right?
And procreate, as you mentioned earlier.
And procreate. Which is odd because usually procreation creates pain ultimately in so many cases. It's very bizarre, isn't it, how we go. So, right. So when we come back after the break, Steve, let's talk about that awake asleep thing that happens with many people on the road to enlightenment or awakening. And for those of you tuning in, we're talking with Steve Ryals about his new book, Drunk with Wonder. Awakening, what does that mean? Who is the divine? Do you know? Are you hearing voices? How can we be sure if that still small voice inside of you knows what it's saying? Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in just a minute with Steve Ryals. I'm your host, Maryanne Comaroto.